All right. Hi there, Epidemics. Welcome to class. So we've got our basic round of announcements. This week, the assignment is another essay number 2, and that's due Sunday, March 13th before midnight. The good news is spring break is next week, so we all get a little bit of a break, at least from the classes. And there's going to be a short reading assignment that I want you to look over an article that I've posted on Blackboard before we get back from spring break. So it's called The Key Distinction That Helps Clarify the Path Forward on the Pandemic. So it's related to the COVID-19 pandemic, but I think it'll be interesting to talk about. In addition, I want to remind everybody, daylight savings time begins Sunday, March 13th. Not that it matters for this class because we won't have class next week, but if you have other obligations, you don't want to be late because you forgot to change your clocks. Although nowadays we all have, we use our cell phones and our computers for a clock, so it's probably all going to mostly be updated by itself. I am also looking for somebody to share notes. So if you take notes, rather than just take screenshots and are willing to share them, please let me know. Send me an email. I would greatly appreciate it. All right. Any questions about last week's material or anything else before we get started talking about the flu? Okay. So nowadays, modern flu kills between 20,000 and 50, not 250, 50,000 Americans each season. Mostly this is young children, older people, and people with other pre-existing conditions, especially respiratory issues. If you've got severe asthma, for example, or if you are on immunosuppressants because you're being treated for cancer, or because you have an autoimmune disease. So all of these can make you more vulnerable. The flu is very, very contagious, and you can spread it even when you don't have symptoms. So you may get it, not have any symptoms, your immune system's fighting it off, and then you go visit grandma, and grandma gets the flu. So I don't know about you guys, but I think the masking thing, flu season, I'm thinking about wearing masks for flu season every winter, because that way I just don't get the flu. And I hate the flu. I've had it. I had it a couple of years ago, and it knocked me out for about 2 weeks. Fever, lethargy, vomiting, the whole bang. It's not just a cold. So when we look at flu, one of the things that we think about is that the flu changes every year. And I'm going to get deep into some science here about why that is. So we've used the term antigen before. Does anybody remember what an antigen is?
It's a response detected by the immune system that identifies a harmful foreign body.
Yeah, yeah. It's something that the immune system recognizes as harmful. So flu has two antigens on the surface. And I'm going to tell you the names, but I'm not going to ask you to remember the names. So we're going to call them H and N. One is hemagglutinin and the other is neuraminidase. This isn't infectious diseases. You don't have to remember the names. H and N is good. And so I'm sure you've heard of flu strains described. Oh, Nate, go ahead.
Just an educated guess. I know that the suffix hemo, that's blood, and neuro, that's like brain or nervous system relative.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep, that's where those roots are from. Okay. So you've probably heard of flu strains like H1N1, H5N5, and that sort of stuff. That tells us which version of the H antigen and which version of the N antigen are on that particular virus strains. And there are 16 versions of the H antigen, and there are 9 versions of the N antigen. So this is why when a new strain shows up, you may or may not have an immune response. So if last winter it was H3N5, H antigen number 3, N antigen number 5, and this winter it's H5N1, even if you have antibodies against the H3 and N5 antigens, you don't have antibodies against H5 and N1. So it's basically like you're seeing a brand new virus. It's not something you're going to recognize. This change, these changes in antigen from year to year, it's called antigen shift. And they happen all the time. It's very, very common for this to happen. In addition, flu is an RNA virus. Its genetic material is in the form of RNA. We've mentioned RNA viruses before. When a virus has RNA or its genetic material, it mutates very rapidly because the process of making copies of that RNA, it's messy and it makes a lot of mistakes. And those mistakes are the mutations. So it's going to be able to change rapidly because of that, the fact that it is an RNA virus. Okay, screenshot. All right, so while the flu virus can go through mutations and come up with new antigens, there's also, and that's Okay, hang on, let me go back a sec. Antigenic drift is due to genetic mutations. Okay. So that's antigenic drift. Now, on the next slide, this is antigenic shift. So confusing terminology, these terms sound very, very similar. They both change the antigens, but they do it in slightly different ways. Antigenic shift happens because flu, let me make that in black, can infect humans. Flu can infect birds. Flu can infect pigs. Now, the viruses in Nate, yes, go ahead.
So that means that the virus is zoonotic, right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Now, the version of the flu that infects humans primarily infects humans and sometimes only infects humans. Sometimes it can move into pigs and birds. The flu that infects birds can sometimes infect humans and sometimes infect pigs, but it primarily infects birds. The flu that infects pigs primarily infects pigs, can sometimes infect humans, and can sometimes infect birds. So it's not that every strain of the flu can infect all three of these. It's that all three of these groups have flu that has the potential to infect each other. Julia.
Is flu that infects birds, is that avian flu?
Yes. Yep. And the flu that infects pigs is swine. Oops. Swine flu.
Oh, that's what swine flu is?
Yes.
Because like obviously I've heard of it, but I just never knew what it was.
Yeah. That's the version that primarily infects pigs.
And people can get it too, right?
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So, what is going on? If a pig is infected by a flu that it caught from a duck, so it gets a version of bird flu, and it gets a version of human flu, or it has a version of swine flu. When you're infected with multiple strains of flu virus, you get something called reassortment, which means that the new flu virus is being produced will have some genetic material from both the bird flu and either the swine or the human flu. So if I'm going to draw this for you guys in the white box, in the, hang on, whiteboard. All right. We got two different kinds of flu. This flu has a series of genes that make proteins that are specific to this flu. This flu also has a series of genes that are specific to it. If both of these infect a pig, the pig can make new viruses that have some genes from this version and some genes from this version of the flu. Chimerized? I haven't heard that term. It sounds right because it is kind of a chimera between these two different flu strains.
Just the term, I mean, I've heard it in terms of like practical use. Like when they test other viruses and they include a portion of a virus to see how it would respond in different organisms. I know that they refer to it as a chimerized virus. I didn't know if it was that was just a scientific term for man-made, engineered, or if there is its own term for when it naturally occurs in like a wild setting.
Generally speaking, when we talk about the flu virus, we use the phrase reassort. So reassorted virus rather than chimerized. I don't know that chimerized is wrong though. How are we understanding this concept? Silence. Sounds like we're confused.
I super get it.
What was the question? I'm sorry to cut you off, Jerry.
It's all good. No, she said, were we understanding what she was saying? Hybridized, chimeric. It's called a chimeric virus, not chimer, whatever, however you said that word. But yeah, I get it. It's like two parents making a new child type of deal.
Thank you. Yes, that's a good analogy. It's like two parents making a new child. Good. That's an excellent analogy. Thank you for that, Jerry. Okay, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. So this new virus, the reassorted virus, now is going to be genetically and antigenically unique. Which means it has a unique combination of H and N antigens on its surface, which means your immune system's not going to recognize it. These recombinations tend to happen every few decades. And when that happens, you usually have pandemic-like outbreak of the flu that is deadlier. So we talked about how the flu kills 20 to 50,000 Americans in a winter. When you have an antigenic shift and you get one of these reassorted flu strains, you're going to be on the 50,000 or even higher than that. So we're going to have a lot more deaths in those years. All right. Screenshot, good to go. Questions? I know this is pretty deep in the science. Okay. So when we look back at the 1918 flu, we saw multiple waves of the pandemic. These multiple waves are very common in a pandemic. We're seeing it right now, right? We've had several waves of the COVID pandemic. For the 1918 flu, the second wave was deadlier. So were they different diseases? Why was the second wave deadlier? Well, unfortunately, the truth is we only have a few samples of the virus. So we can't say, look at a sample from the first wave, compare it to a sample from the second wave. But we do know the people who were sick in the first wave had resistance to the second wave. So clearly it had just changed. And it is not, it is common for pathogens to change pathogenicity or virulence over time. We got Nate, go ahead.
Isn't that just a fancy way of saying the virus mutated? Like
Yes.
properties evolved? Okay, thanks.
Yes, it evolved. What do we mean when we say pathogenicity and virulence?
Transmissibility and lethality.
Perfect, yes.
And I believe virulence is lethality. Pathogenic is how it spreads.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, pathogenic is spreading and how it causes disease. Virulence is how severe the disease is. Yeah. This can increase or decrease. We've seen this. The Delta wave of COVID was deadlier. It was more virulent. The Omicron wave was less virulent, but much more pathogenic. It spread much wider and more easily. And so a lot more people died from Omicron because it infected more people. But as a percentage, a case fatality rate, Omicron had a lower case fatality rate than the Delta version. You can see the same thing, or we did definitely see the same thing in 1918. So the 1918 flu strain probably started infecting people in the winter of 1917 to 1918. As it was passed from person to person, it increased in pathogenicity. And then the second wave increased in virulence.
So viruses, in terms of like mutation or evolutionary, it's not true that as they progress, they become more pathogenic. Because I've seen that with like a few viruses, but I didn't know if, well, I mean, we're not talking about a living thing, so there's not really a standard or rules that these things adhere to, but maybe it was just like a pattern.
Yeah, so the layman's understanding tends to be that diseases become less virulent over time. There's no guarantee for that. There is nothing to say that it that it doesn't become more virulent over time. Same thing with pathogenicity. There's no rule that viruses get more or less pathogenic over time. You're right. Viruses don't pay attention to the rules. They don't read the textbooks. Okay. Screenshot so we can move on. Did anybody notice this sign about
Just
spitting?
looking at it saying don't spit.
Yeah. A lot of cities passed laws against spitting on the public sidewalk during the 1918 flu. And a lot of those rules are still on the books.
Really?
So
It's like that in Japan too. Well, it's not, they don't enforce the law, but they highly, they'll look at you funny if you spit on the ground, walk and drink, eat and walk at the same time. So.
yeah.
Spitting grosses me out, so I'm all for that. I think it's the grossest thing.
Yeah. Yeah, right there with you. Okay. So fall of 1918 was really the peak of the pandemic in the US. And as I've mentioned, military bases tended to be hardest hit, with up to 20% of soldiers bedbound at any given time. It's 1 out of 5, so sick they couldn't get out of bed. So the military's like, we've got to stop this. We can't have 20% of our soldiers unable to participate in fighting and being sent off to Europe and all that stuff. So what did they do? They quarantined new arrivals for 3 weeks. They started using masks in medical care. Before the 1918 flu, it was not standard for doctors and nurses to wear masks in hospital settings or during surgery or anything like that. So it became standard to start using masks. They tried to increase space between beds. And they put, the soldiers' beds head to foot. So you're smelling your neighbor's feet, but you're now, almost 6 feet away from their exhalations during the night. Julia, go ahead.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but in the picture, are those all women, like female members of the military?
Yes.
So was that like their job was to like deal with the sick?
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. They also would stretch curtains between beds, especially in the hospital settings, so that, again, you're reducing the exposure of one person to somebody else's exhalations, which we all know can spread virus. Now, if Nate's got a good connection. Nate, you were in the military.
Sadly. No, I'm just kidding.
Do you think the officers followed these rules?
In terms of what, pandemic?
Quarantining, wearing masks.
Well, to be frank, I was lucky. I got out right before the COVID pandemic. But I can tell you the Air Force, they're pretty adherent to guidance, regulations. I mean, I don't know if it's any similar, but when people were sick, you'd go to the, it wasn't an ER, it was like an urgent care. And then based on your conditions, you would be quarantined and we weren't allowed to leave your quarters for however long. I know that because I have friends that are still in the Marine Corps and stuff, and they were wearing masks like the whole time up until the guidance got like fishy.
Yeah.
You know, with how they magically changed it to 5-day quarantine out of nowhere. But yeah, they adhered to it. You know, particularly with the leadership change, things were more direct. So yeah, I'd say that. I mean, but you can't ensure every individual is going to do it, but the people in positions of I don't want to say power, but seniority, they adhered to it most definitely.
Well, that's lucky. Megan, you got your hand up?
Yeah, I don't know if this is comparable to like the military, but I went to a Black Lives Matter protest, I think 2 years ago, and the only people who weren't wearing masks were the police. And this was like before the vaccine, before everything. So like, I don't know, maybe I got to see the bad end of it, but I saw people in active positions of power who were rejecting, you know, the standard.
Yep.
No, I went to BLM protests too, and they weren't wearing any.
Yeah, police not synonymous with military. But again, it's different organizations. I get the argument, but there's a lot more like you're under a tight thumb when you're in the military. It's like your life is monitored, your appointments are all set up. Police, like that's a job. Like the military is like a whole way of life. It's not like, oh, I'll just BS the rules. Like, who cares? Like, you got people watching you. Well, not every minute, but assigned to you, making sure you're going to medical appointments, making sure you're doing everything you're supposed to do. So it's vastly different.
Okay, well, during 1918, these rules, the quarantine, you know, spacing out, yeah, the officers didn't follow them. So the people with seniority ignored the rules. Viruses do not respect military rank. They don't respect wealth. They don't respect social status. And while in the US, the wealthy definitely now get better medical care, during the 1918 flu, the officers would come in, they would bring the flu to camp and spread it around because they weren't following the quarantines. Okay, I'm getting ready to go to the next one.
I just wanted to add one more thing. I know particularly like the restriction, like, you know, I was in Japan. They were, even today, they're not like members, like armed service members that are stationed there, they're still not allowed to go into Japan, and they haven't been able to go into like big urban areas due to the pandemic, I think for a couple years now. And they're finally starting to like ease up on that. So they felt like they had to adhere to international stuff too.
Yeah,
So
times change. Okay. So I'm going to tell the story of Camp Grant, which was in Illinois in August of 1918. On August 8th, Colonel Hagedorn took command. The camp at this point was over capacity. They didn't have enough spaces in the buildings for people, for the men, and many people were living in tents. So in September, Hagedorn decided to ignore the Army regulations on crowding and moved men from the tents into barracks. The nights were getting cold, winter was coming. The medical staff met with the colonel, said, dude, we spaced everybody out to reduce the risk of flu spreading. We can't crowd the barracks like this. Colonel Hagedorn ignored them. He did decide to keep the men on base so they weren't visiting the local towns where there were cases of the flu. Did that work? No, of course not. September 21st, the first cases of flu were reported. By the end of the day, by midnight, 108 men were hospitalized. The units they were in were isolated, public gatherings were canceled, but even so, within 4 days, 1,000 men were hospitalized. And the deaths began. Within a week, there were not enough ambulances to transport men to the hospitals, not enough sheets, not enough beds, and barracks were being converted to sick beds. All of the healthy men were now being used to support the sick, including things like unloading medical supplies, doing laundry. Back then, mattresses were stuffed with straw, and so the healthy troops were stuffing new mattresses. Okay, so things are bad at Camp Grant. The day of the first death at Camp Grant, 3,108 men were put on a train to another camp. So here we've got a raging flu outbreak at Camp Grant, and they put 3,000 men on a train. Medical experts were saying, please don't do this. Please don't put these men on a train. They're potentially infected. We don't want them to go to another camp where there may not be any flu. It didn't work. A lot of the men who boarded the train got sick during transit, and they started coughing, and they started getting feverish, and they started bleeding out their noses and out their ears. So during train stops, the troops would get off to get away from the sick. What do you think's happening as these troops are getting off the trains to get away from the sick people?
They're spreading the sickness they have themselves.
Yes, exactly. They're spreading it to the towns where they stopped. When the train arrived in Georgia, over 700 men had to be rushed to the hospital. Eventually, 2,000 of them would be hospitalized, and over 300 died. 10% of the men that boarded that train died from the flu. Camp Grant, things were getting worse. It was getting hard to keep up with the paperwork, the death certificates, and family notifications. October 8th, Colonel Hagedorn received the daily death notifications and issued a very strange command. He ordered all the personnel in the headquarters building to stand outside for inspection. So all the personnel from headquarters were lined up outside, and they heard a single pistol shot from inside the building. Hagedorn killed himself. Again, it was pretty clear that his behavior caused a lot of these deaths. Okay. Screenshot this one. This is just an example from one camp during the peak of the 1918 flu pandemic. It's not the only story like this. It's just an example to give you an idea of how bad things were. And the fact that people were aware that their actions were harming others, which is something I think a lot of people in the current pandemic are not being aware of. All right, so the end of the pandemic. In the US, by the end of 1918, the flu was largely gone. It still was occurring in other parts of the world, but it gradually started to disappear in other places. Why? This is, of course, something we're all very, very interested in. How do pandemics end? It's possible that herd immunity got high enough. That's definitely a possibility. Enough people were exposed, the flu couldn't find enough people who were vulnerable to keep spreading. It's possible the virus attenuated. Have I used attenuated with you guys yet? With the vaccine section?
It sounds familiar, but I don't want to say yes or no. Could you just give a brief summary of what that means?
Yes. Unless somebody wants to chime in. Does anybody remember exactly?
Is that when the virus naturally becomes weaker over time?
Naturally or artificially, yes. We use it.
Artificially would mean through the success of vaccines, right?
Artificially means we've modified it in the lab to make it weaker because we need it for a vaccine.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. So attenuated, yes, it became weaker. It happens. We get mutations. Sometimes they become weaker. The fact is, we're not sure exactly why the 1918 flu pandemic ended. We can only give educated guesses. So, why did so many die of the flu? How does the flu kill people? The primary way flu kills people is pneumonia. Pneumonia is inflammation of the lungs with consolidation. So inflammation is swelling. Consolidation is the lungs are filling with cell debris, so dead cells, fluids, and immune system cells. This causes lungs to become in areas solid or clogged. So you can't get air into all parts of your lungs. Nate, go ahead.
So I can only speak because I have respiratory stuff, asthma.
Mhm.
When you mean cell debris, fluids, could that all be like generalized as mucus, or is it more to it than just that? Because like when I get short of breath, like what happens is my airways become inflamed and mucus like fills the outsides, like causing the airways to be smaller.
Mhm.
I didn't know if it was along that lines or similar to that. I know.
It's similar. Mucus is liquid and cell debris. But it's also certain excretions within the respiratory system. But yes, it's very, very similar. But when we say consolidation, it's more than just mucus. It's, literally the lungs are filling up with materials. Okay, so the lungs can become clogged. It can't get enough oxygen from the air. But flu also impairs the immune system. So it kind of turns down the immune response. Lots of viruses have this ability to turn down the immune response. It's pretty common in disease-causing viruses. But what that means is that there can be other infections. And if it's bacteria, so if it's bacteria, nowadays we have antibiotics, but bacterial forms of pneumonia tend to be much deadlier than viral forms of pneumonia. So if it's bacterial pneumonia, you're going to have a higher death rate. We can also have something called a cytokine storm. You've probably, well, you may have heard this again, talking about COVID. What the heck is a cytokine storm? White blood cells release cytokines, which are proteins that cause inflammation. So these activate or turn up the immune response. These attract other white blood cells to the area of infection, in this case, the lungs, and results in what we call hyperinflammation. Any scientific word that, oops, did not mean to do that, that has hyper in it, hyper means more than. So more inflammation than normal. This is most common in young adults with healthy immune systems, but this hyperinflation can make your symptoms worse. If you've got a lot more inflammation, a lot more white blood cells in the lungs, that's pneumonia right there. So the cytokine storm can actually contribute to the symptoms of pneumonia. Okay. How are we doing with this part? Are there questions on this?
So I text my nephew. He's in a Marine base in Carolina. He said they don't wear masks. No one's wearing masks there. If the county or area they're in, if it's a medium or low COVID, no masks. So they're currently not wearing masks there.
Okay.
Now, is the hyperinflammation, is that caused by the immune response?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I think that's kind of how my asthma works too. I don't know if you ever heard of this term eosinophilic.
Yep.
Yeah, it's kind of similar to those lines.
Yeah. Eosinophils are a type of white blood cell, and eosinophilic asthma results in more white blood cells in the respiratory tract, which increases inflammation. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go to the whiteboard real quick. So the results of the 1918 pandemic. Anti-spitting laws, we talked about those. Several states developed departments of health to try and come up with ideas to how to manage public health, to come up with regulations for public health. And the National Institutes of Health were formed, which is a nationwide organization that is supposed to do a lot of, or funds a lot of research into major health problems. If a 1918 flu pandemic happened today, so one with the same virulence, the same pathogenicity of the 1918 flu, we would have over 2 million dead Americans, over 240 million dead worldwide. And we've already got about 1 million dead Americans from COVID, but it's taken more time than the 1918 flu. Worldwide, we're not close to 240 million. Other countries are frankly doing better than us at reducing deaths. Nate, go ahead.
I know it was just like a simple comparison, but do you think that possibly those numbers would be reduced with therapeutics, other medicines we have for flu? I know not all flus are the same, but kind of how they work is similar. I didn't know if anything we've had since 1918 would be a dramatic bolster, but I assume they wouldn't be this ridiculous, right?
Yeah. If the 1918 flu came back, certainly modern health practices, modern medical treatments would reduce the number of dead. Absolutely. Absolutely. This is just to try and give you a sense of what the scale would be like with the current population that we have, to kind of help you compare it to COVID.
I think just going through 3 years of what we went through now, we'd probably be a lot more well-minded, I guess you could say. Or maybe not, based on the opposition to some of the stuff, but that's neither here nor there, right?
Well, it's definitely here. It could be worse. Avian flu strain H5N1. So a flu that primarily affects birds, but it can spill over into humans. And when it does that, it's bad. A few years ago, there was a spillover event Spillover means it spread from birds to people. It infected around 859 people. That's not many. It didn't have high pathogenicity. It didn't spread easily. But over half of them died. So if that had if it had high pathogenicity, that would have been absolutely devastating, right? Half of the people who get sick dying. When this strain is found in poultry, like chickens or ducks, countries often kill large numbers of birds. They will literally wipe out all of the chicken farms in the country to prevent spillover into humans. Of course,
So lethally, this was kind of similar to like the MERS, SARS, in terms of how dangerous it was. Actually,
Yes.
even worse.
yes. We do fortunately have a vaccine for domestic birds against avian flu, the H5N1 strain, so we can vaccinate flocks if there's money available, right? And manpower, because a typical poultry farm is going to have thousands of birds. It's hard to go in and vaccinate thousands of birds in a very short time period. So there's scaling issues there. And of course, the human vaccines, researchers try to predict which strains are going to become common. They sometimes get it right, sometimes not so much. So they tend to pick several and make vaccine against those. And they either use killed virus, attenuated virus, or viral proteins. Regardless, there's no live virus in the vaccine. And there's no way for there to be live virus in the vaccine. So people who say they get the flu from the flu shot, they probably mean they had an immune response and they got some snuffly nose kind of thing, maybe a sore throat, but that's your immune response. That's not the flu, and it is not as dangerous, and it doesn't last as long because it's not really the flu. Okay. Whew. So that's the end of my notes on the 1918 flu. Any questions or thoughts on that? Comments?
So if a bird has the flu, you get it just from handling it, or the same way the flu is transmitted from person to person? It's kind of like inhaling what the bird exhaled.
Inhaling what the bird exhaled.
Gross. Okay.
That's why a lot of these recombined versions of the flu start on farms. Poultry workers get exposed.
Oh, so kind of like cowpox. I see. It's hard work on the farms, isn't it?
It is hard working on farms, absolutely. Yeah. There have also been, when there is concern about avian flu, county health departments or state health departments will sometimes get some chickens that are called sentry chickens. I just love the term. And they will put them in a portable enclosure out somewhere where they're likely to interact with wild birds and see if they get the avian flu, to see if the wild bird population in the area has avian flu. Kind of a early warning that it's coming through the area.
Like the canaries in the minus tunnel type of
Yes.
deal.
Yep, same
Yeah.
kind of deal.
I mean, it sounds weird, but could you still eat those birds?
I don't see any reason why not, as long as you cook them.
Right. Cheers. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're still delicious.
But again, you know, if you've got an area with avian flu and they cull 100,000 chickens, you're not going to be able to sell that many.
That's
People aren't
true.
going to be eating that many that quickly.
So
Like
when they
with the prion infested deer, Jerry, much better off.
Well, I don't eat venison. So the whole mad cow disease deal, and there's a recall like every year or so, kind of. And you can't consume that meat.
You
even if
cannot consume that meat. Prions are very different from viruses.
Okay, cheers.
You said they're more so just like proteins.
They are like
themselves.
proteins.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you can't temperaturize them.
Which is weird because you can normally destroy proteins with temperature.
So I just had a question about the break. Is there any assignments other than the reading that you'll be giving us over that short period of time? Okay, wonderful, beautiful.
Literally a break.
It's a break. It is really a break. Yes. Okay, so since we stopped the flu, we're done with the flu. We have one lecture before spring break. I can throw together a one-off lecture on any of these topics, or if you have something else you want me to pull together a quick lecture about, what do you guys think? What would you like to learn about? We've talked about prions.
Ebola.
Ebola?
That because I was writing in the essay Sunday or Saturday about how the smallpox disease virus helped with us treating Ebola. So I would like to hear about that if possible, if other people want to as well.
Okay, we have 2 votes for Ebola. Anybody want to chime in for something different?
I like the topic of virus caused cancer. Like I know about HPV, but I can't think of any other one.
That is cool.
There is Epstein-Barr virus, which causes mono, is also been found to be a cancer-causing virus. And that's pretty cutting edge news. That information, I think, was just released this year.
So does that mean if you've had mono, like you could potentially get cancer because that virus never leaves your body?
Whoa.
I'm gonna have to go through the literature on that.
Okay.
I don't know off the top of my head, but I think that's the case because I'm pretty sure Epstein-Barr is one that if you get it, you get it, you have it. Like chickenpox, if you got chickenpox, the virus is probably staying in your body. But I'd have to double check on that. All right, we have two votes for Ebola and 1 for cancer.
What was the voting for? Sorry, I was speaking with a coworker.
Because we finished the 1918 flu, we have a lecture, another lecture this week before spring break. I don't want to go on to the next topic, so I'm doing a one-off lecture.
Oh, I vote for Ebola.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm like Catherine said, I really don't care. Well, let me rephrase that. I'm indifferent, but Ebola, that's kind of recent. Well, not recent, but it was like a big thing for like 4 months and everyone lost their shit. So
Okay,
I'd be down with learning that.
we'll talk about Ebola next time then. All right. If that's it, we're going to call it a day.
Peace, guys.
And I'll see you guys next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Wanted to let you know I did.